the world's greatest short stories. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Nelson Olmsted's review of the world's greatest short stories. Tonight, our story to be reviewed is by Edgar Allan Poe, and by way of warning, if your stomach is easily turned, better not listen to The Case of Monsieur Valdemar.
My attention for the past 3 years had been repeatedly drawn to the subject of mesmerism. And about 9 months ago, it occurred to me, quite suddenly, that in the series of experiments made hitherto, there had been a very remarkable and most unaccountable omission. No person had as yet been mesmerized in the act of dying. It remained to be seen first whether in such a condition there existed in the patient any susceptibility to the magnetic influence, and second, whether, if any existed, it was impaired or increased by the condition, and thirdly, to what extent or for how long a period the encroachments of death might be arrested by the process. There were other points to be ascertained, but these most excited my curiosity, the last in especial, from the immensely important character of its consequence. Well, in looking round me for some subject by whose means I might test these particulars, I was brought to think of my friend Monsieur Ernest Valdemar, the well-known author. Monsieur Valdemar, who had resided principally at Harlem, New York since the year 1839, is, or was, particularly noticeable for his nervous temperament, which rendered him a good subject for mesmeric experiment. On 2 or 3 occasions, I had put him to sleep with little difficulty, but was disappointed in the other results, which his peculiar constitution had naturally led me to anticipate. His will was at no period positively or thoroughly under my control, and in regard to clairvoyance, I could accomplish with him nothing to be relied upon. For some months previous to my becoming acquainted with him, his physicians had declared him in a confirmed phthisis. It was his custom, indeed, to speak calmly of his approaching dissolution as a matter neither to be avoided nor regretted. And when the idea to which I have alluded first occurred to me, it was of course very natural that I should think of Monsieur Valdemar. I knew the steady philosophy of the man too well to apprehend any scruples from him, and he had no relatives in America who would be likely to interfere. I spoke to him frankly upon the subject, and to my surprise, his interest seemed vividly excited. I say to my surprise, for although he had always yielded his person freely to my experiments, he had never before given me any tokens of sympathy with what I did. His disease was of that character which would admit the exact calculation in respect to the epoch of its termination in death, and it was finally arranged between us that he would send for me about 24 hours before the period announced by his physicians as that of his decease. It is now rather more than 7 months since I received from Monsieur Valdemar himself the subjoined note: "You may as well come now. My doctors have agreed that I cannot hold out beyond tomorrow midnight, and I think that they've hit the time very nearly. Signed, Valdemar." I received this note within a half hour after it was written, and in 15 minutes more I was in the dying man's chamber. I had not seen him for 10 days, and I was appalled by the fearful alteration which that brief interval had wrought in him. His face wore a leaden hue, the eyes were utterly lusterless, and the emaciation was so extreme that the skin had broken through the cheekbones. After passing Monsieur Valdemar's hand, I took his doctors aside and obtained from them a minute account of the patient's condition. And before they left, they promised to return about 10 o'clock the next night. According to their opinion, Valdemar would die around midnight the next night. But when they'd gone, I spoke freely with Monsieur Valdemar on the subject of his approaching dissolution, as well as, more particularly, of the experiment proposed. He still professed himself quite willing and even anxious to have it made, and urged me to commence it at once. Well, a male and female nurse were in attendance, but I didn't feel myself altogether at liberty to engage in a task of this character with no more reliable witnesses than these people might prove. I therefore postponed operations until about 8 o'clock the next night, when the arrival of a medical student with whom I had some acquaintance relieved me of further embarrassment. It had been my design, originally, to wait for the physicians, but I was induced to proceed first by the urgent entreaties of Monsieur Valdemar, and secondly by my conviction that I had not a moment to lose, as he was evidently sinking fast. Well, I commenced the passes which I had already found most effectual in subduing him. He was evidently influenced with the first lateral stroke of my hand across his forehead. Although I exerted all my powers, no further perceptible effort was induced until about some minutes before 10 o'clock, when the doctors called. I proceeded without hesitation, exchanging, however, the lateral passes for downward ones, and directing my gaze entirely into the right eye of the sufferer. By this time, his pulse was imperceptible, and his breathing was stertorous, and at intervals of half a minute. This condition was nearly unaltered for a quarter of an hour, and the expiration of this period, however, a natural, although a very deep sigh, escaped from the bosom of the dying man, and the breathing ceased. That is to say, its stertorousness was no longer apparent. The intervals were undiminished. The patient's extremities were of an icy coldness. Well, at 5 minutes before 11, I perceived unequivocal signs of mesmeric influence. I could make his eyelids quiver, and at 3 o'clock in the morning his pulse was imperceptible, the breathing almost stopped. His limbs were rigid and cold as marble, but still the general appearance was certainly not that of death. I ventured a few words of conversation. "Monsieur Valdemar," I said, "are you asleep?" He made no answer, but I perceived a tremor about the lips, and was thus induced to repeat the question again and again. And at its third repetition, his whole frame was agitated by a very slight shivering. The eyelids unclosed themselves so far as to display a white line of the ball, and the lips moved sluggishly, and from between them, in a barely audible whisper, issued the words, "Yes, asleep now. Do not wake me. Let me die so." "Do you feel the pain in your breast, Monsieur Valdemar?" "No pain. I am dying." At dawn, he was still barely alive. I again asked him if he were asleep. At my fourth repetition of the question, he said, "Yes, still asleep, dying." And just then, there came a marked change over the countenance of the sleeper. The eyes rolled themselves slowly open, the pupils disappearing upwardly. The skin generally assumed a cadaverous hue, resembling not so much as parchment as white paper, and the upper lip, at the same time, writhed itself away from the teeth, which it had previously covered completely, while the lower jaw fell with an audible jerk, leaving the mouth widely extended and disclosing in full view the swollen and blackened tongue. Well, I presume that no member of the party then present had been unaccustomed to deathbed horrors, but so hideous beyond conception was the appearance of Monsieur Valdemar at this moment that there was a general shrinking back from the region of the bed. There was no longer the faintest sign of vitality in Monsieur Valdemar, and concluding him to be dead, we were consigning him to the charge of the nurses, when a strong vibratory motion was observable in the tongue, and at the expiration of this period, there issued from the distended and motionless jaws a voice, such as it would be madness in me to attempt describing. It seemed to reach our ears, or at least mine, from a vast distance, or from some deep cavern within the earth. It was a voice of distinct syllabication. Monsieur Valdemar spoke obviously in reply to the question I had propounded to him a few minutes before. I had asked him, it will be remembered, if he still slept, and he now said,
"Yes. No. I have been sleeping, and now I am dead."
Well, no person present even affected to deny or attempted to repress the unutterable shuddering horror which these few words thus uttered were so well calculated to convey. And when we all overcame our stupefaction, we examined the body again for signs of life. There was no breath, and the attempt to draw blood from the arm failed. The only indication, indeed, of the mesmeric influence was now found in the vibratory movement of the tongue whenever I addressed Monsieur Valdemar a question. He seemed to be making an effort to reply, but had no longer the sufficient volition. Well, the next day we discussed the propriety and feasibility of awakening him. But we had little difficulty in agreeing that no good purpose would be served by so doing. It was evident that so far death, or what is usually termed death, had been arrested by a mesmeric process. It seemed clear to us all that to awaken Monsieur Valdemar would be merely to ensure his instant or at least his speedy dissolution. And from this period until the close of last week, an interval of nearly 7 months, we continued to make daily calls at Monsieur Valdemar's house. All this time the sleeper remained exactly as I had last described him. It was on Friday last that we finally resolved to make the experiment of awakening or attempting to awaken him. I made the customary passes, but these for a time were unsuccessful. And then I asked, "Monsieur Valdemar, can you explain to us what are your feelings or wishes now?" Well, the tongue quivered, or rather rolled violently in the mouth, although the jaws and lips remained rigid as before, and at length the same hideous voice, which I had already described, broke forth.
For God's sake, quick, quick, waken me, quick. I say to you that I am dead.
Well, I was thoroughly unnerved, and for an instant remained undecided what to do. At first I made an endeavor to recompose the patient, but failing in this through total abeyance of the will, I retracted my steps and as earnestly struggled to awaken him. In this attempt, I soon found that I should be successful, or at least I soon fancied that my success would be complete, and I am sure that all in the room were prepared to see the patient awaken. For what really occurred, however, it is quite impossible that any human being could have been prepared. As I rapidly made the mesmeric passes, his whole frame at once, within the space of a single minute or even less, shrunk, crumbled, absolutely rotted away beneath my hands, and upon the bed before the whole company there lay a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putrescence.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, Nelson Olmsted has presented a review of a great short story of world literature. The Case of Monsieur Valdemar was written by Edgar Allan Poe. And now is Mr. Olmsted with the closing word.
Thank you. When Edgar Allan Poe was a youngster, he wrote, "The world shall be my theater, and I must either conquer or die." And several weeks before his death, he wrote, "I do believe God gave me a spark of genius, but he quenched it in misery." Born 131 years ago in Boston, Poe represents one of the earliest founders of modern short story. I've often wondered what would have happened if he'd been born in this century instead of the last one, if he were alive today. I wonder if he ever would have written the stories and poems that have consecrated his memory. Perhaps he would have found life less miserable in the 20th century, and by that same token would probably never have stooped to prose at all, for in his heart always was an undying belief that his real work lay in poetry. However, Poe is considered one of America's finest, if not the finest writers, and I'll have to admit that my preference among authors lies in his direction. Many people detest his works as meaningless monstrosities, while others admire his poetic prose as the glorious perfection of the English language. We are all entitled to our own opinions. But now next week, a modern story written by William March. The title is The Little Wife, and it strikes a note of human interest and pathos which you will find impelling, I'm sure.